the pandemic.
Notre génération.
Nevertheless, there have been a lot of challenges arising, but today we want to focus majorly on the issues of human rights and the issues of democracy and governance. My name is Emmanuel Wawire, and I will be your moderator for the day. But before we could kick off, I would just humbly request some of our guests on the panel and the keynote speakers to introduce themselves. I will start with one of our keynote speakers to be able to introduce herself. We'll start with Dr. O'Regan. Professor O'Regan.
Well, good afternoon to all. Bonjour à tous. C'est un plaisir de participer à cette conversation avec ses collègues. I'm going to speak in English. My name is Kate O'Regan. I am a former judge of the South African Constitutional Court, where I served from 1994 to 2009, and also a former ad hoc judge of the Supreme Court of Namibia. And currently I am the inaugural director of the Bonavero Institute of Human Rights at the University of Oxford.
Thank you. Dr. Solomon.
Yes, good afternoon to you all. I would like to thank you very much for the kind invitation for me to join you today for this important webinar. I am particularly pleased to join this webinar alongside Justice O'Regan, who, although she doesn't know me, who I have known for a long time, having been at the Constitutional Hill for 3 years, as a PhD student at SciFac. And it is a great pleasure, Justice O'Regan, to see you. You have been an inspiration for many in the legal fraternity in South Africa, but also outside of South Africa as well. My name is Solomon Ayala Derso. I am currently the chairperson of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. This is the premier human rights body of the African Union, which has been in existence. Indeed, it's one of the oldest organs of the African Union, in existence for over 30 years now. I also teach at Addis Ababa University as adjunct professor of human rights. I also run policy research think tank based here in Addis, working on peace and security issues in particular. It is great to be here with you.
Thank you. We will go to Mr. Karin. Kindly introduce yourself.
Great, thank you. Again, I'm going to echo what the moderators just said and the keynote speakers. It's an honor to be with you. My name is Karin Kanizana-Tulia. I'm the Africa Advocacy Director at Human Rights Watch. We've been working on issues of human rights for decades at the organization. It's an honor to be with Dr. Solomon and Justice O'Regan as well, having had the privilege to acquire my master's degree at the University of Western Cape many years ago. I come from a background of transitional justice. I've worked in 6 different countries on the continent, and looking forward to the discussion and the insightful comments that I'm sure we're going to have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would give an opportunity to Ms. Rotendo. Ms. Rotendo. As Ms. Rotendo prepares, let's have Nozolo.
This is social media.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Nokolo Chabangu. I am currently the Vice President for the Southern Region Organization of Pan-African Female Youth Leaders, which is all about women empowerment and making sure that human rights, preferably or mostly women's rights, are advocated for, and those who cannot speak for themselves are spoken for. and I'm also the Deputy Secretary General for the Southern Revolution. Thank you so much for having me on this platform.
Thank you. Is Ms. Rutendo ready to introduce herself? Okay, as we wait, Mr. George, you're up. Mr. George. Okay, let's have Ashina.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm also very honored to be joining this panel and the discussion with all the participants. My name is Ashina Msumi. I work as the Policy and Legal Officer with the Global Initiative for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. As the name suggests, I've been part of a team that reflects on how we can organize our systems and governance structures to ensure that everyone is able to enjoy economic, social, and cultural rights across the world, particularly in Africa.
Thank you very much. I see Ms. Rutendo is back on. Could you kindly introduce yourself? Ms. Rutendo, introduce yourself. Ms. Rutendo. As Ms. Rutendo is trying to put together herself, she's the program coordinator for Youth Bridge Foundation, and we'll be hearing from her maybe during the session as she tries to fix her microphone or earpiece. Without wasting due further time, once again, we welcome you to this webinar, where we will be discussing about the management of COVID-19 pandemic in Africa, and most importantly, the implication for human rights and good governance. As it will be going, it is supposed to be a 1.5-hour event, but I'll take through the audience our program for the day. We'll have a keynote speech from Professor Kate Oregon, who already introduced herself. I will not be going through the introductions again. We'll also have a keynote speak from Dr. Solomon Ayele also. And at the same time, we'll have a panel discussion from the panelists who had introduced themselves earlier. Just to re-echo, we have Ms. Karin, we have Ms. Rutendo, we have Ms. Solo, we have George, we have Ashina, and me, Emmanuel Wawire, as the moderator. My name is Emmanuel Wawire. I'm the Executive Director for Faraja Africa Foundation, and at the same time, the Youth Chairperson for UNESCO. Without wasting further due time, I'd like to take this honor to invite Professor Kate Oregon to give us her keynote speech.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Wawire, and thank you to all the organizers of this webinar. I don't think there can be a more important question for our times than how to manage the COVID-19 pandemic, not only from a public health perspective, which of course is crucial, but also from a good governance and human rights perspective. And I wanted to start by saying that in moments of crisis, we need effective and rapid government, so that we need to be able to be sure that governments can operate effectively to combat a crisis. But one of the things we know as constitutionalists and constitutional lawyers and human rights lawyers is that when we give powers to government to operate, we also want to make sure that the powers we give to government are used for the purposes for which they're given and are used with appropriate care and respect for the rights of everyone. So a crisis is a time when thinking about how government should both be empowered on the one hand and constrained on the other is really a very important question. If we look around the world at the moment, we see that countries are basically taking one of three major ways to approach the COVID-19 pandemic. They are either declaring a state of emergency in terms of their constitutional frameworks, or they are using national legislation which has been pre-existing and aimed at dealing with a disaster or a public health emergency and provides powers to government to be used in those circumstances, or they're enacting individual and new legislation specifically to deal with COVID-19. Probably the most common route is the second one, but there are quite a few states that have declared states of emergency. Whichever one of these routes is used in order to give power to the executive, as constitutionalists and human rights lawyers, we want to make sure that there are appropriate constraints in place for the use of executive power. And I would suggest that there are really four that we want to look at. The first is we want to make sure that any special powers given to the executive at this time are clearly spelt out in law. This is a rule of law requirement. It means we, as citizens and residents of countries, can know what powers government's been given. It also means that government officials, whether it be members of police services or public health officials, know in writing what their powers are. And that's an important constraint on the abuse of power, is that the law clearly sets out what the powers are. Secondly, we want to make sure that the systems of oversight that ordinarily operate in a functioning democracy continue to operate. So obviously that is the legislature. We want parliaments and committees of parliament to be able to call on the executive to come and explain the steps that have been taken. We want courts to continue to operate as best they can, to be able to hear urgent matters and other matters during the pandemic. But we also want what are loosely called fourth branch operatives, so ombudspeople or public protectors, as we call it in South Africa, human rights commissions, information regulators. We want them to be able to operate as well. So the ordinary systems of scrutiny and oversight of the executive, we want to see continuing. Thirdly, we want to be sure that where limitations on rights are part of the way in which the executive acts, that they are necessary to combat COVID-19. So in nearly all our countries, we've had lockdowns which have infringed our rights of freedom of movement. And we want to know that those are as necessary as they can be for limiting, battling COVID-19. But there are a whole range of other things that governments are doing. And finally, and very importantly, we want to be sure that any special powers that have been given to the executive at this time are time limited. They are subject to what might call sunset clauses, that they will come to an end when the COVID-19 pandemic is left behind us, which hopefully won't be too far in the future. So it seems to me that whichever country you're coming from, you want to analyze what your country's response has been, firstly, as to whether it's used one of those three mechanisms, and secondly, whether it meets those four requirements. Of course, the range of things that government is doing are enormous, from strict lockdowns requiring people to stay at home, from attempts to improve tracking and tracing through the use of getting big data from mobile network operators and from the health services. There are a whole range of different kinds of activity, and all of those need to be scrutinized to ensure that to the extent that they do limit rights, that they do so in a way that is proportionate to the threat that we're facing. Given that I only have 5 minutes, I'll stop there, but I'd certainly be happy and look forward to the conversation, both with people who are attending and with my colleagues who are panel members. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just a reminder to our viewers is that you can send in your question through the chat. Our team will be ready to receive your questions and direct them to the keynote speakers and to the panelists. And as we keep on moving on, we can be able to have a conversation both with you and we'll be able to decipher these things. Thank you, Professor Kate, and for the profound insights in that. And hopefully we can still be able to engage during the panel discussion. I would like to take this opportunity to invite Dr. Solomon to be able to give his keynote. Then thereafter, we'll have an opening remark from the Secretary General of ASU, and then we'll have a documentary, And then later on, we can be able to enter a panel discussion. Then the questions that you will be sharing, our dear viewers, we can be able to start tackling them. But for now, please keep the questions coming in, keep the presentations coming in, and then we can be able to summarize later on at the closure. Dr. Solomon, you're welcome.
Thank you very much once again for the organizers of this event, for the kind invitation extended to the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, in particular myself. I fully agree with Justice Kate Oregon that we are in a very extraordinary context. Perhaps this would be one of those exceptional historical events that would have a defining impact, not only on our lives, but also how we relate with the environment, how we relate with the physical and indeed the living environment that we live in, and with the climate. And I think in that sense, therefore, the question that is being discussed particularly, how we engage and respond to the COVID-19 pandemic is extremely important, and one that needs to provide us with parameters that enables us to navigate through this crisis in a manner that would help us to limit the devastating consequences of COVID-19, in a manner that would enable us to take lessons from the path that brought us to this exceptionally disruptive pandemic, and chart new ways of living. So from the side of the African Commission and myself indeed, 4 points that I would like to raise. The first point that I would like to raise asks the question of the past, and this relates to what I consider to be COVID-19 as a magnifier or as a revealer of the structural weaknesses and fragilities of our societies. COVID-19 brought to the forefront of the public view the pervasive socioeconomic deprivations afflicting the masses of our people. Deprivations that have left many at the mercy of this pandemic. As a result of the fact that there are many among us in our societies who are very vulnerable. Others, and all of us, have therefore become vulnerable to COVID-19 as well. Because for COVID, the strongest among us is as strong as the weakest among us. In this sense, therefore, COVID it demonstrates not only the fragilities of the most vulnerable, but also the fragilities and weaknesses even those who are most well off among us. And I think it's important to ask the question, why? Why that is the case? The impact of COVID-19, obviously, although COVID-19 is a leveler in that sense, the impact of COVID-19 is more dire, as we all understand, on the most vulnerable among our societies, particularly people who work in the informal sector, the majority of our people, and the majority of whom women, people living in highly congested areas with no access to water and poor sanitation, people with underlying conditions. And all of these people wouldn't be able to observe some of the COVID-19 related requirements, such as washing hands regularly, sanitizing, and also, importantly, public social distancing, the social distancing measures. These sections of our people are affected in multiple ways, not just in terms of the public health or the health dimensions of COVID. Obviously, because of lack of access to sanitation and water, they couldn't be able to observe. Therefore, they are most vulnerable, as I pointed out. But importantly, the measures that Justice Oregon spoke about, taken by governments, such as lockdowns, curfews, limiting our rights, have also led to the disruption of the livelihoods of these sections of the population in particular. And I wish to observe that these conditions of widespread vulnerabilities arising from lack of provision for socioeconomic rights in our continent is the result of major gaps in the social and economic policy of our states. The perpetuation of the legacies of colonialism and apartheid, deficiencies in priority setting in the development agenda of our countries, and the nature of our economies, and the economic development paradigm that our countries pursue, the global financial and economic system which champions this economic development paradigm. In other words, these vulnerabilities are products of not only legacies of historical past, but also importantly, current and recent past governance failures on the part of our countries. So this is the first point I wish to make. The second point that I wish to make is that COVID-19 is a human rights issue. The African Commission on Human and People's Rights is among the first organs of the African Union to issue a statement on COVID-19 soon after the reporting of the first cases of COVID-19 in a couple of countries in February. And we said that COVID presents a threat to the right to health and the right to life of our people. That states parties to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights have legal obligation under Article 1 of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights to take all the necessary measures required to protect our citizens as the people from the scourge of COVID-19. And these measures would obviously take the measures that would be recommended by epidemiologists, the World Health Organization, and in our case, also the African Center for the Prevention and Control of Disease, Africa CDC. And these measures may take different forms. As Justice Oregon mentioned, they can be taken on the basis of existing law, they can be taken on the basis of a new law, they can be taken on the basis of a declaration of a state of emergency legislation. Whichever form that these responses take, the most important thing is that these responses be one that prevent people from the morbidity and mortality that COVID-19 causes. And of course, considering the weak health system prevalent in our continent, we insisted that investment has to be put in preventive measures, and which means basically that you align your resources, align your capacity around those measures that are possible to implement within the shortest time possible. And those are the kinds of guidelines that we have given. So delays in taking the relevant measures or failures in complying with those measures by states or by government authorities, by officials, non-compliance, all of these would give rise to, obviously, questions of governance and rule of law. When states fail in that sense, therefore, you also have a question of human rights, a question of rule of law. And if, as a result of these inadequacies in actions taken, as a result of these failures on the part of states, if we contract the virus, and if we suffer the serious illness that it causes, and even the death that results from it, then we have to ask the question on whether or not our morbidity or our mortality is just a result of the fact that COVID-19 is a disease that causes serious illness and even causes death, or whether it is added, there is a responsibility on the part of the state as well. So these are the questions. This is the second point. COVID-19 as a human rights issue, imposing certain obligations on states to take those measures, and failure of which results in responsibility. The third point relates to, of course, the question of the present. Once COVID kicks in and states start responding, then a number of human rights issues start to emerge. That is where we are at the moment. And in response to these as well, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights issued a statement in March with 12 points that actually capture a number of issues, including those that Justice Oregon spoke, the 4 points that Justice Oregon spoke about.
Thank you. As we summarize, Doctor, yes?
Yes, I'm going to the last. I'm going to the last point. We are, through that statement, trying to address excessive use of force, restrictions on rights, and spike in gender-based violence, further deprivation of socioeconomic rights, whereby people, particularly the poor, are forced to make choices between dying from contracting COVID-19 or dying from starvation and hunger. And we have been expressing concern and indeed issuing statements on the range of human rights issues that have been arising and continue to unfold as we speak today. And we are in a moment, particularly from a socio-economic rights perspective,
Yes, yes, Doctor.
Where the prospect for the youth, for students coming out of college, and the vast majority of the youth on the continent, the prospect, the future prospect is becoming very bleak as a result of the socio-economic fallouts from COVID. The economies of our countries would be contracting, would be in depression, and the disruption that COVID caused to our livelihoods would have major costs as well. So we are in a situation, combined with the various violations of rights that are being reported, these emerging socioeconomic fallouts are giving rise to a major concern for us as the African Commission, that the pandemic may descend into a human rights emergency. And we need to do everything to prevent that from happening. Finally, looking into the future, the question for us is basically, in the light of this point that I made relating to the kind of reversals that we are going to witness, particularly in terms of some of the gains that have been made, in terms of social welfare, in terms of economic development, such as decline in maternal mortality. We are going to witness with the loss of millions of jobs, millions of our people being pushed to extreme poverty. And in this kind of context, therefore, we have to ask the question, how to address and resolve the kind of socioeconomic policy, the kind of social policy, the kind of governance system that brought us to this level of vulnerability, not just now, but also moving into the future. And that is also a human rights and governance question. And the challenge before us is, therefore, can we seize the opportunity that COVID-19 presents for rethinking development policy, rethinking leadership and our systems of governance, for articulating and building constituency and source of funding for a new human-centered development paradigm, for redefining state-society relationship, and indeed the fragile, highly dysfunctional social contract on which existing patterns of misgovernance is found. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Doctor. And I believe Professor Kate and Dr. Solomon have been able to set the trend. And also, as our viewers, we do understand the issues we are facing. We do know that we are all affected. Some of us cannot move from one district to the border districts in East Africa. We are all under lockdown. And in South Africa, it is even a different story over there. And as our two keynote speakers have been able to highlight these issues, we are expecting a more excited and in-depth dive of what they have been able to present. And we also hope that they can still be with us and we're able to still decipher more of these discussions within our panel discussions. So without wasting time, I'd like to take this opportunity to invite the Secretary General of All Africa Students Union to officially open this webinar, and then we can be able to dive into the documentary and then the discussion. Peter, you are welcome.
The COVID-19 crisis has changed the world completely in the last few months. Within the same period, we're witnessing a surge in human rights violations across the continent and the world. We have put together today's webinar because we're alarmed at the rate at which the pandemic has become breeding grounds for authoritarian governments to blatantly abuse the fundamental human rights of their citizens. Across the African continent, we're witnessing some brazen human rights violations. There are instances where police and military brutality have surpassed the direct impact of the COVID-19 itself. In fact, on 16 April, the BBC reported that security forces have killed more Nigerians than the COVID-19. 10 journalists covering the impact of Uganda's lockdown were beaten ruthlessly by security forces. In South Africa, the police have fired rubber bullets at shoppers amid the lockdown. In several African countries, security forces armed variously with guns, whips, and tear gas have been beaten, harassing, and in some cases killing people as they enforce measures aimed at preventing the spread of COVID-19. While this list is not exhaustive of the human rights violations across the continent, it gives us a cursory view of the current situation amid the coronavirus containment measures being deployed by governments, and we should be alarmed. Will this blatant abuse of human rights become the status quo? The inertia on the part of the citizens of most African countries to oppose authoritarian tendencies during this pandemic is further exacerbated by the growing fear of the coronavirus itself and the outlandish escalation of commitments to cede more powers to the states to act to preserve life. Should these human rights violations continue, it will further deepen the already existing structural inequities that lie within the body politic of weak state institutions which are commonplace across the continent. And on account of what we know of past human rights abuses across the continent, we surely cannot look on with indifference. Owing to the importance of the subject matter today, we've been joined by some great speakers who have made a career of relentlessly pursuing human rights and are passionate about the state of human rights on the African continent. That they have made time to join us today is testimony to their commitment to the pursuit of human rights and its central importance to the building of democratic institutions across the continent. They will help us to seek answers to some pertinent concerns. For example, what will be the tipping point that will awaken citizens to ask for the sanctity of human rights to be preserved? What are the nature of human rights violations happening in these times? What implications will further encroachment on human rights have on the governance systems in African countries? Will the current measures be an exception or they will become the norm even when the pandemic has passed? What must we do to make sure human rights do not become a trade-off during the pandemic? Our history as the All Africa Students Union is rich with several instances where we have stood united to oppose authoritarian regimes. We fiercely fought the apartheid regime together with our colleagues in South Africa. We stood with our colleagues in the Soweto uprising and consequently named June 16 as the African Students' Day. And so as far as students' rights and human rights in general are concerned, we will continue to relentlessly defend those rights at all times, because the fight for human rights should never stop regardless of the circumstances. Human rights must never constitute a trade-off package. I'm happy to announce that we're standing together with our fellow students in Cape Verde to demand a 50% reduction in tuition fees due to the lack of education during the COVID-19. We congratulate Erica and her team for initiating and leading the 50% reduction campaign. We acknowledge our student unions for the direct intervention they have contributed to their government's efforts to tackle the COVID-19 pandemic. We continue to stand with you in solidarity. You are not alone. I hope that when the pandemic passes, we will remember what students of the continent did to alleviate the toll of the COVID-19 pandemic, sometimes at the peril of their lives. Please stay with us for the full duration of this exciting webinar. Finally, we continue to advise that you stick to the recommended guidelines to stay safe. Thank you.
Secretary General of the All Africa Students Union. For those of you who may not know the All African Students Union, it is the students' umbrella body for the entire 52 states of Africa, and will be continuing to engage more with him. I would like to now take this opportunity. I would like to take this opportunity for us to dive into the panel discussions. And we will be still engaging now with most of the people, looking at the questions. What we'll be looking at, what are the specific implications of the COVID-19 pandemic on human rights and on good governance? And we'll be giving an opportunity and starting with our very own Miss Karin. According to you, Miss Karin, how much of our freedom is enough to trade for safety? Yes, Ms. Karin.
Thank you, Emmanuel, and thank you all again. Thank you for the invitation extended to Human Rights Watch. I think that before even responding to the question, I would like to emphasize again that these times are extraordinary, and these are times where I think there's an ultimate test to the social contract between the state and the citizens. And that's very important to realize. So when we talk about trading freedoms for safety, again, what is implied here is that, of course, within the COVID-19 context, that there are limits on gathering associations which have to be curtailed in the interest of public safety. And obviously, some freedoms have to be given up for a higher good. That's understood and accepted. However, as Justice Oregon highlighted, there are questions which the governments and citizens have to address. Are emergency powers used in a way that is lawful, necessary, proportionate? Are they time-bound, covered by legislative and judicial oversight? And it's important to note that within the continent, there are about 152 separate pieces of emergency measures across Africa. And the vast majority are executive actions with not much oversight and accountability. You have countries like South Africa and Botswana, which do have robust parliamentary oversight of these measures, for instance, but many others do not. What does that mean? It means that the debate we're going to have here, based on the reports and the research we've done at HRW, Human Rights Watch, really is taking place alongside, within the context of 5 human rights issues which have been impacted by government measures. And I'm going to quickly go through the 5 we highlight. The first one is the issue of institutions. We must highlight issues around the application of containment measures for people in custody, including prisons and detention centers, closed institutions for older people, people with disabilities. Within this context, you still have in parts of, in Nigeria, Cameroon, and other countries, people who are still with mental disabilities who are still shackled and hidden away. Survivors of gendered violence, for instance. As you know, most prisons in Africa are overcrowded. A lot of up to sometimes 70% of inmates in pre-trial detention. The second one is the issue of migration. And when we think of government measures, we need to realize that one of the most serious impact has been on migrants, refugees, and internally displaced people, including in conflict situations in countries like South Sudan. There are concerns that many migrants, and these are lawful or not necessarily documented migrants, who are employed in informal sectors, and in some countries like South Africa, being excluded in the provision of palliative economic measures. We see incidents of COVID-19 linked to discrimination. Not long ago, all of us, I think, were shaken up by acts of discrimination against Africans in China, for instance. But we've also seen discrimination against Africans by Africans, hate crimes and in countries, and xenophobic, for instance, treatment in countries like South Africa. And many of these migrant workers have been cut off from family and home because of travel restrictions. In conflict areas, you have concerns that the spread of the virus and the restrictions to contain it could hamper the work of peacekeepers, humanitarian aid providers, human rights monitors, and other actors to protect civilians and hold perpetrators to account. The third issue is the issue of technology. There's a focus we need to have on access to information in an era where you have digital information. And when you think of access to information about the virus, including through the internet, that is essential for protecting lives. Monitoring how government are using surveillance technology in deploying emergency powers. Organizations like ours and others have highlighted how misinformation, especially by government officials, can undermine efforts to limit the spread of the virus. A good example is in Burundi, where, for instance, the government at some point claimed did not publicize any case, and said that it was protected from the virus because it put God first. In Ethiopia, there was disruption of telecom service, and in other countries as well. The fourth issue is the abusive enforcement of measures. And I think the previous speaker mentioned it, Peter mentioned it. You see situations where security forces deployed as part of implementing the public health response, especially in countries with historically abusive forces, have been implicated in the use of excessive force to enforce stay-at-home measures, social distancing orders, and in some cases as a ploy for repression of political opposition and LGBT people. And there are many instances in Kenya, Uganda, and other parts of the continent. And I think when we talk about the abusive enforcement of measures, we need to realize one thing. In most cases, the citizens, because of the disruption, because of a legacy of abuse and conflict and wars, citizens are afraid. There are fears of curfews, lockdowns, and that caused the need to set up rights respecting measures. Because the public's compliance with lockdown is also complicated by an embedded fear of curfews and emergencies, because it's often associated with coup attempts, terrorist attacks, and insurgencies, with inevitably, which most of the time trigger rampant abuse by security forces. The last point I would like to make is really about, on this, in terms of the 5 human rights issues which have been impacted, is obviously, and one cannot overemphasize this, the issue of poverty and inequality. It's been mentioned from the beginning of this discussion. There are concerns, obviously, that lockdown are especially punishing. We've seen the emergence of the criminalization of poverty. when we do our interviews and we do our research, you see people feeling literally punished as low-income earners in the informal sector, including domestic workers. We've mentioned the cases in South Africa, in Uganda, etc. And it's important to also recognize that we have 238 million Africans living in informal settlements. And that's a big number. It means with the COVID-19 impact, it means that some of these livelihoods might be at risk. Some countries, and I wouldn't say, as much as we talk about the impact of the COVID-19 and the impact of government measures, it's also important to recognize that some countries have put in place some safety nets. The question remains whether this will be sufficient given the sheer numbers of people needing assistance. And then lastly, I think I would like to talk about the right to health as a priority moving forward, post-COVID-19. What should governments do? I think Dr. Solomon mentioned it. And using the words of Kenyan Governor Alfred Mutua, which he really captured the prevailing mood in Africa when he says, "We will cope and die together regardless of social class. We like to fly overseas for treatment, leaving our health systems in shambles, but those countries are now facing serious challenges. Where will we go now?" What does that mean? He continues and says, "COVID-19 is an equalizer. It humbles the powerful and equalizes them in the eyes of the poor. However, it must remind us why we need to invest in ourselves, and we must act now." And I think this is a call on all of us, whether you are a Pan-Africanist student, whether you are a commissioner, whether you're a government official, a parliamentarian, a lawyer, that we need to engage on what I would call an Afrocentric solidarity engagement. We need to think of proactive, multi-sectoral approaches. We need to prioritize some of these issues we're going to talk about, especially the right to health. Dr. Solomon mentioned socioeconomic development, the free trade, and lastly, building resilient healthcare systems from bottom up, working with communities, restoring the social contract between governments and citizens. I'm going to stop here. And thank you again. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. You make very profound statements there, and the quote mostly looks, the quote kind of speaks to what we all go through in Uganda. For example, we believe, according to the World Bank, over 1 million people are going to lose their jobs. And we are looking at Kenya as well, having a lot of layoffs happening there. And I was also discussing with my colleague in South Africa, in Zimbabwe, it is they're also facing the same kind of challenge and problem. However, also, as we move into the next other question for the next panelist, we want to have the connecting voices on these different things. Professor Kate, you told me to say Oregon. Yes, I hope I'm pronouncing it well. We know very well that in Africa, 11 countries are scheduled to vote despite COVID-19. My country is one of those. Of course, we are still in a dilemma of understanding what is what. With these stringent yet relevant controls set or to be imposed, how can we prevent abuse to sanitize the ballot and to the same kind of restrictions that are spread around during this time, during this period?
Well, I think it's a very big question, and I think answering it really requires a lot of understanding of each individual country that's facing elections, because it really isn't a one size fits all. You need to understand what the circumstances are in the country. I mean, running elections generally is a particularly challenging task. And although it's particularly challenging under COVID-19, I think we need to recognize that there is still a lot of work on running elections that needs to be thought about across the continent. I I think that social distancing is not necessarily incompatible with running elections. It just needs to be thought through. And of course, it will depend on the timing of the elections and the extent of the spread of the virus at the time in the run up to the elections. It creates challenges for big election rallies, perhaps more than actually running the election. So I think each of these things needs to be thought through very carefully and worked out in the context of each jurisdiction. On the other hand, I would, it may be that at times postponing elections seems to be the right thing, but one needs to be very cautious that thinking around when they will be rescheduled for if they are postponed. So I think elections generally require a lot of our attention and thinking about how to do them well and build trust in the processes amongst African people. But I think that there's no sort of one size answer to your question. I think each country needs to look at its own circumstances, the extent of the spread of the virus at the time, what can be done to make sure that it doesn't exacerbate the spread of the infection rate. And we should be very cautious about decisions to postpone in the sense that they can undermine our democracies, which we don't want to happen.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'll give an example, maybe back to you, Dr. Kate, is that in Uganda, the president has ordered no political gatherings should happen. However, he is able to do the meetings, is able to meet people and be in the face. How would you speak to most of that is happening? Recently, we had elections held in Burundi, and we also have other countries prepping up. How, looking at those peculiar examples, how best do you think it should be done, let's say, in those other ones who are trying to organize, knowing that World Health Organization has said the vaccine for COVID can only come out within a period of 18 months. That means that COVID is still here with us. And that means that social distancing is a reality. However, how can we speak? Imagine we have young people out there who are planning to go for campaigns, to run for political positions, to participate in the voting without, how can they now protect themselves? Speaking out from the policy making side, could you speak to the young person who is watching right now? Or what should they do?
Well, I think the first thing is we can't withdraw from our societies because of COVID-19. We need to continue to engage, but we need to engage consistently as best we can with the public health guidelines. This, of course, is a challenge across Africa. I mean, the first thing is, regular hand washing, and we know that many of our communities, access to clean water is not possible or is very scarce. So acknowledging that is a challenge. I do think that it is surprising how much one can do, nevertheless following the public health guidelines, the social distancing, appropriate hygiene. In South Africa, we've adopted the approach of wearing face masks, and even although there does seem to be some uncertainty as to exactly how much protection that gives, it certainly seems to be some protection against the spread of the virus, which of course goes through droplets. So I don't think it means that we have to withdraw from politics. In fact, I'm absolutely sure we shouldn't, and nor should it mean that we should stop campaigning. But it does mean that one needs to do so in a way that is socially responsible and consistent with public health guidelines. In relation to actually managing the big questions that you talk about of equal-handedness between political parties in relation to access to either holding gatherings or, more importantly, access to the media and so on, I think this is a matter that electoral commissions across the continent are going to have to look at to try to make sure that there's not unfairness in relation to the ability to campaign because of the restricted ability to hold very large gatherings, which of course have been a key part of electioneering across our continent and globally in democracies everywhere. Big political gatherings are a big part of that. And it does seem as if the health evidence is clear that large numbers of people gathering in crowded spaces are not what you want if you want to prevent the spread of the virus. So we're going to have to think about new ways to campaign and ways that, again, don't reproduce inequality, and not everybody, many people won't have access to bandwidth, so use of the internet is not necessarily an equal way. So thinking about how to campaign in a way that will really reach everybody seems to me to be a challenge that we're all facing.
Okay, thank you very much. Karin, there is one of the attendants asking a question here, which also relates a bit to what Professor Kate has answered, though now this is not in the election areas. This is in relation to our neighborhood. Says, I'm a bit worried that the countries are suffering immensely due to the effects of COVID-19. How are we helping our fellow neighborhood countries? In other words, how are we able, if I understand well, how are we helping our neighborhood countries? But also the other question that we can add on is, if we are not helping our neighboring countries, how can we help? Because you find that the quote from your quote, you said we need to invest in ourselves and we need to do it now. So could you just answer this within a minute, and then we can be able to move to the next question.
Yes, no, very quickly, I would like to make just a small comment on the elections point. I think it all depends on the context in which these elections take place. You used the example of Burundi, but there was an ongoing political crisis in 2015. So obviously adding COVID-19, that can only exacerbate some of the fears that the population and the oppression that, or the force that's been used to hold these elections. The second point, in terms of what can we do, I think Africans around the world are already doing something. And I would like to mention the contributions being made as we speak right now by the diaspora. Nigerians in the US, the Association of Ethiopians, who have been setting up mechanisms, platforms on which they are raising thousands and thousands of dollars to send back to their countrymen and women. That is the first thing. The other thing is, obviously, one has to realize that helping within a context of travel restriction is very difficult. Even amongst ourselves, you're not going from, from your house to your neighbor's house as easily as you used to. But I think what can be done in that context is also preparing and organizing targeted messages to the community, working with rural religious community leaders to expand and upgrade their approaches and the mechanisms that they are setting up within their communities. I think my 1 minute is up.
Okay, thank you. It is a discussion that we're going to recurrently continue having, and also it leads to mostly the next question, which is directed to George in relation to what Karin was talking about. Is in the era of the restrictions backed by science, how can we ensure that the freedoms backed by economics and integrity remain a priority? George.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you very much. So basically, you are talking about how do we guarantee economic freedoms. And so talking about economic freedom, you are talking about livelihoods issues, jobs, existing one, safeguarding existing jobs, and so on and so forth. The role that government needs to play. And what is happening on the continent, and I will cite some examples from Ghana, is, the fact that governments, or some of our government, unfortunately it's not all of our government, are looking at stimulus packages. But before I go into that, I think it is important to put into perspective how economic rights are being violated and how we can then resolve that. The first point is how the restriction has led to businesses closing down. In Ghana here, what we observe is that during the lockdown and even after the lockdown was lifted, many people are not patronizing micro enterprises, micro businesses, and these micro businesses are the are the ones that take care of vulnerable groups like the youth, women. And one thing that has not come into the picture is how do we even support startups that are often owned by young people to survive in this context. So I would go straight to the point in terms of making some recommendations. I think we are aware about the situation in terms of economic right. I think, first of all, our government must commit resources into for the purpose of recovery, economic recovery. Many businesses are going down. Many have already gone down. Many people have been laid off. And so one support area is how to get these businesses back. So recovery fund becomes very important. The other is basically to step up effort to support the economy. We have seen how fragile our economies are. And so one of the best things to do will be for us to look at, firstly, how do we step up, support to the economy to get our economies back. And then in doing that, we have to find a way to coordinate and target what I call discretionary fiscal stimulus. So for example, the tax incentives that governments are giving. And here I want to be specific. This is about African youth. Government needs to ensure that in terms of targeting youth that are in micro businesses, that are in, doing their own stuff, and even employment organizations that are employing youth will be given some sort of fiscal space so that there's some kind of negotiation for a delayed tax payment or even complete tax exemption to such entities so that they can employ more of the youth and vulnerable groups. I think one of the things is to also commit, we are talking about right as if it doesn't cost money. It doesn't cost money to enforce civil protection mechanisms. And oftentimes, we do not prioritize spending in that area. And so that is one area that we will need to look at. Then, since we have had many people losing their jobs, we need some form of social protection, and that social protection must be geared towards supporting workers who have lost their jobs, putting emphasis on youth, women, and vulnerable groups. And I think that even in all this picture, because of the issue of discrimination, we are not looking at how we can bring people who have been infected and have recovered back into productivity. And I think that these people, we need to, government need to support them to be on their feet. Some may even be losing their jobs. We are in Africa. Many will be thrown out of their homes. And I think that we need to support that. But more importantly, and at a higher level, many of our countries are suffering liquidity support challenges, and that requires some form of liquidity support to critical sectors that are employing the youth and vulnerable groups. And this must be championed by our central government. The government must also be thinking about introducing public guarantee schemes. I think all of these measures, should be geared towards supporting businesses that are folding up, young people that are, setting up their companies, startups, but are having challenges. And I talked about deferred tax payment and possibly complete write-off when we know that organizations cannot survive. I mean, if you haven't worked, if you haven't produced, there's no way you can make money to be able to pay taxes. One thing that is not coming out clear is that, I mean, and this here we need to take a swipe at our own AOU. AU. AU has not provided leadership in terms of bringing together our ministers of finance to present a united front. We don't seem to be learning as Africans, and that we are handling this issue as if we will get the best by being individualistic. And so I think that, and this is a call and a challenge to the youth to begin to take on the AU structures to say, look, we need you to coordinate the effort of our finance ministers, because they are leading the economic recovery programs that we will have to put in place, so that as a country and as a continent, we speak the same language and we learn from each other in terms of the economic stimulus packages that we'll be developing and the macroeconomic measures that we will introduce to build some resilience in as well as to recover from the challenges that we are going through. The last point I want to make is about monetary policies. And here is linked to the point I just made about as to how our ministers of state can provide or create a macroeconomic environment for businesses to bounce back, for young people to be supported, but also to devote a lot more resources into supporting spendings that boost, put the economy back on track, as well as creating jobs and supporting, for example, farmers, especially getting the farmer youth to go into farming, because if there is nothing at all, if there is no opportunity about COVID, it gives us the opportunity to begin to say that Africans, we can feed ourselves, and that we have a whole army of youth who can be supported to go into agriculture. And lastly, we need to guard against the issue of political and elite capture in economic package, in the economic package that we are putting up, because in this continent, that is very likely. It's very likely that, and I have a very funny example, a youth program that a 68-year-old man presented himself as youth to benefit, just to deny the ones that really qualify for it. And so we will need to look at how we guard against the issue of political capture in the kind of economic stimulus packages that we give to boost production and support the youth. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George, very much. I see the connection there, connecting with what Karen was talking about and what you were talking about. I'd like to just give a small, to give the AU 1 minute, represent Dr. Solomon. Karen talked about criminalization of poverty. And George has also added that we need to see the AU, the ministers, sitting to harmonize positions on issues to deal with the economy. For example, if we're not able to have tax holidays and we are penalized by our revenue authorities, how is the HR Commission going to help us be able to advocate for such? Because many people are losing their jobs, others based on maybe genuine reasons, others based on exploitation from the employers who are using the opportunity to exploit their workers or to kick them off without necessarily observing what their rights are. Maybe they sign contracts, maybe they're entitled to doing their job because there is no reason of laying them off. As the AU, is there something that you are working on pushing the African Union ministers who are permanent members to be able to resolve this issue within the region? Let's use 1 minute so that we can be able to move the discussion on. Dr. Solomon.
Thank you very much. I would shortly leave you all, but I would like to thank you for the opportunity. I think a number of points have been raised. One, in relation to the question of the right to health, it's extremely important that we shouldn't, this COVID moment shouldn't be reduced to a one issue situation. That is just a health issue, a matter of a health issue only situation. It's therefore extremely important that we take into account all other areas of socioeconomic rights. That's why access to water is directly linked to health, and therefore the need for providing access to water, even for purpose of prevention, hand washing, and so on and so forth. Similarly, sanitation, provision of education in terms of people being informed of what they need to do and how best they could do to protect themselves. So these are extremely important points that we also need to bear in mind. In terms of, I think, the responses that have been taken, that's why I made the point that the responses adopted by governments and the consequences of those responses on our rights and freedoms are giving rise to very serious concerns that this situation may descend into a human rights emergency as well. That's why it's extremely important that all those issues of human rights that have been listed have to actually trigger us into saying that this is actually the time when we need rights more than normal times, exactly because this condition of emergency has concentrated a lot of power in the hands of the executive, with all the risks associated with that level of concentration of power. And those consequences are the ones that we are witnessing as we speak, and it's unfolding. And therefore, we need to demand more of those monitoring mechanisms that Justice Organ talked about. We need to also ensure that, one of the things that heartens me looking at this COVID situation is basically, one, the level of mobilization and organization at the level of individuals and communities to extend support and help to others who are severely affected as a result of the COVID-19 measures. The other thing that hurts me is the role that is being played by human rights organizations and also by national human rights institutions, the National Human Rights Institution in Kenya, in South Africa, in Nigeria, reporting and documenting what is happening and telling Nigerians that more people have died of violence by government security forces than by COVID-19. Means that the problem is not just COVID-19, but the problem is basically how we respond to and enforce those responses by our governments. There is a very serious problem of disregarding human rights in this point in time, using the excuse of the pandemic. Then that also ask yourself, who is affected by those violations? One of the things that you see is basically the people who have the most difficulty to comply with these measures are mostly vulnerable people, the poor, and those who are killed by the enforcement measures are also mostly the poor. And this is where you find the connection between poverty and criminalization of poverty. Basically, de facto, poor people are seen as violators of the law, violators of the COVID-19 response measures, and thereby the heavy-handed militarized responses are basically falling on poor people. And this is extremely worrying and troublesome. And in some ways, of course, it is not a new thing. It is an extension of an existing problem. But this situation presents us with an opportune moment to put into question all those existing problems that we have been living with and say, no, we can't continue no more with these. Now, in terms of the socioeconomic dimension and the role of the AU, I think perhaps it would be good just to highlight that what the AU is doing may not be enough, and indeed, regional integration have been tested during this period because countries have been looking inward rather than trying to cooperate. We see these with the closures of borders and with the kinds of issues that have emerged, for example, in the East African community between the East African community countries. All right, but at the same time, we also have to see a number of things that are happening within the AU. For example, one of the most troubling stuff that is happening and continues to happen in the world is that countries are basically collecting all kinds of diagnostics, therapeutics, which are required and necessary for testing and also for taking the necessary biomedical measures required by countries affected by COVID-19. And the result is basically that Africa is one of the continents that's affected by these hoarding of diagnostics, therapeutics, and so on and so forth, including Africa is not able to have access to these things even on market price because of restrictions that have been imposed. So one of the things that the AU is doing is basically to create a collective platform for purchasing these medical inputs collectively. That is what they are trying to do. So it's only a couple of days ago that the Africa CDC rolled out this joint platform rather than individual countries scrambling with their weak positions to get access to market to these diagnostics. So if you see that, the addition and contribution of the African Union clearly see. Myself as the chairperson of the African Commission, together with the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Ms. Bachelet, we issued a joint statement addressing the socioeconomic dimension of the issues that we are raising. Some of our countries couldn't, for example, roll out fiscal stimulus packages, economic relief measures, because they don't have the policy space to roll out those measures. And this has to do with their international obligations and commitments and the restrictions that they have entered into due to international monetary regulation. It's only by asking accountability that we can roll back some of the adverse outcomes of this period so that it wouldn't be institutionalized, that it would be limited only for the emergency situation. Thank you very much again.
Thank you. Viewers, that was the chairperson for the African Commission on Peoples and Human Rights. I would now that we've heard mostly from the policy end, we have Professor Kate and we have George who have spoken. We want to shift the guns to the young people themselves, where we'll be having Ms. Zolo being able to tell us. Zolo, if you've been following very well the discussants, the previous discussants have been sharing, we're talking about the freedom of assembly, and by far the right most affected by management of this pandemic. Social media is helping in filling the vacuum left with the imposition and the restrictions, for example, social distancing and so on. How can the digital rights be protected as vigorously as other rights, for example, looking at this particular period? And also throwing in some bit of context in this area. We have the right to internet access, the right to education and so on, but looking at other countries, the cost of internet is still very high. In countries like Uganda, we pay taxes every day to access social media. And in other countries, you go to maybe like Ethiopia, you find that recently they removed the ban from the accessing different social media platforms and so on. However, still the cost of internet seems to be high there. And in South Africa, where you are, the internet is very high. The cost is still very high that side as well. So back to you in 5 minutes, how can the digital rights be protected of as vigorously as other rights that we're discussing right now, knowing its importance?
Okay, thank you, Emmanuel, for the question. I think it goes without saying that right now, more during lockdown period, seeing as though people are not as mobile as they were before the lockdown period. And due to social distancing as well, people are now working from home. Some don't even have jobs anymore. So in as much as digital research is becoming more, there are still restrictions to access to the internet or to this digital information. So, for example, what's happening right now, private companies are making decisions that would limit human rights in reference to access to information, like internet and all those things. Firstly, in March, some major social media platforms put thousands of third-party content moderators on paid leave, saying they could not perform their sensitive work remotely. So now this leaves only second party or just first-hand filtering of information that could go online. And in as much as that may be a good thing to a certain extent, it also infringes on people's rights to express themselves. For example, if we are to say, okay, social media platforms or technological advancement is helping in fight the public health crisis, in the sense that online circulation of information of people to know and also keep to date with what's happening around the pandemic, but also with the expansion of adoption of the digital surveillance techniques, there's also infringement on the rights to privacy. Because now, as people are working from home, there is surveillance, there are platforms that regulate or see how people are working and checking on their status of work from time to time. And to a certain extent, that could lead to what we could call overreach of surveillance, when you're now infringing into people's privacy and how they run their day-to-day lives, and also on violation of rights to privacy and freedom of expression, in the sense that people's whereabouts even now can be located easily, even by their own companies. So I think the problem now comes with the measures that have been put in place for such infringement of rights, in the sense that the government should, to a certain extent, refrain from undue censorship of information. There has been a ban on IP addresses, or when it comes to certain information that affects, how can I put this, that affects certain individuals. If they are going to put certain measures, they should not be partial, in the sense that when it comes to violence that people are facing regarding their expression when it comes to COVID-19, some of those things are not aired online, depending on who or how the issue was handled. You understand? People who are being abused out there due to domestic violence, like females, especially, speaking on behalf of females, right now with working from home and all these things, there seems to be a high rise in domestic violence. And because of that, many of these things are not put out there online. Some of them are infringed so as to put up a good front for certain individuals or for certain organizations that would not really want this information let out there. So in South Africa, I would say what could possibly help is putting up prosecution of fines or IP address bans that can be introduced on a wider scale, than limiting it to only maybe serious cases, you understand. Also introducing measures as serious as human rights violations could possibly ensure that people respect digital rights as well. That's where the Independent Communications Authority of South Africa, ICASA, I think that's where their work really begins now during this pandemic, because they are meant to, their mission is to make sure that information is sent in, to everyone without any partiality. It's accessible to everyone, be it people in the rural areas, be it people in affluent areas. Because right now, with the rights and all these things, very few people have access to internet, you understand. So in as much as the information is being sent online and all these things, it's partial, with people not being able to see all these things or being informed via these platforms. But then I would like to commend South Africa to a certain extent in the measures they have tried to put up in making sure that people are aware of what's happening and how this pandemic is being handled. Like, for one, they've set up automated WhatsApp groups to provide credible and factual details, because in as much as we're speaking about the digital rights, in making sure that everyone has access to these rights, there's also violation, in the sense that there's also uploading of information that is not factual. So now people who are reading don't know what is true and what is not. And also with the private companies retrenching, if I can say, or putting people on paid leave who are meant to do this job of making sure that what is online is the right thing, it kind of makes it hard to balance the two. So I think that's where ICASA can really step up in their regulations of these measures, in making sure that people do get the factual information, and the rights of these people who upload or post this information is also protected, because several people now, or several entities that would like to impose or suggest, put out their information out there, they can be violated privately, such that to an extent they do not step out to put out the information out there of what's actually happening. Because in as much as you look at this COVID pandemic in a bigger spectrum, I think it's better looking, if you're to referencing it to good governance. In as much as the governance would be looking at a country as a whole, I think it's better to have it broken down maybe to communities, because certain communities differ from other communities. In as much as the government would send out messages on the number of tests or what the programs that are running right now, 80% of people in rural areas do not have access to that. So now the rights to those are limited. So the government should then now come in balancing equity more than equality. Because in equity, we're now talking of fairness, in balancing it out, in the sense that in as much as the students who are now working from home, like here in South Africa, like the University of like WITS, it has given students 30 gigabytes of data to study towards that. But now, how many people have laptops? How many people have, access to use that data? Because some use the laptops from school, but now they cannot access it at school. And the conditions at home do not allow them to get access to it. So the rights, the digital rights, are meant to be protected as much as other rights, in the sense that right now it's the platform that's being used mostly for communication in trying to combat this COVID-19 pandemic. So I think those are my 3 points in trying to combat that. South Africa, or Africa as a whole, they need to set up standards that would provide equity to everyone, affluent or the people who are underprivileged. And the regulations need to be stiffened so that people take digital posts and these things seriously. And also the Independent Communications Authority of South Africa to step in and make sure that they become the intermediator between the people and the government in making sure that there is smooth flow of information and only factual information. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zolo. Maybe to just recap, mostly looking at how we can filter from fake news and unverified information. And also to add a voice there is Twitter has been verifying all medical personnel who have been giving information on behalf of government or institutions that are fighting COVID. And Facebook has been doing the same as well. And I do would love to also add a voice. Basically, access to social media and digital platform does not really equate to young people having them or using them, because not all of them do have these gadgets. Therefore, a conducive environment from government, again, as Nozola has said, should be created. Policies that subsidize the prices of cost of a laptop, costs of smartphones and so on, so that more young people may have access. We'll applaud Kenya. Kenya has done something like that. They have the Uwezo program where a young person who is entering campus can be able to get a free laptop and they only pay a fee of 10% of the actual fee, something like that. We need more of those programs within for the rest of Africa. And we know that our governments can be able to do this. Only that we need to be coordinated and to have a joint voice. Thank you very much. We do, as members, as we are winding up, I will be just dwelling and then we can go to conclusions. We just have Miss Ashina, Miss Rutendo. Please, if you're there, say hi, because we had some challenges with your audio. Miss Rutendo, are you there? Okay, it seems we have lost her. As she is, the team is working on that. We'll go to Ms. Ashina and go to the legal question, where we're saying, as a practitioner and a campaigner of economic, social, and cultural rights, how do you think Africa governments can balance freedom, safety, and economic empowerment of their people? That is to Ms. Ashina.
Thank you, Manuel. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you clearly.
Great. So I'll try to be very brief, as I know that time has really moved on. But just to begin with, I couldn't agree more with the sentiments that have been shared by the previous speakers, including Dr. Solomon Dresso and with Karine, particularly on how COVID has done more to reveal the pre-existing challenges in our systems, in addition to adding more challenges to the systems that we have. And it's really an opportunity to revisit how we organize our systems. Economic, social, and cultural rights are fundamental because this includes things like the right to education, to health, water, sanitation, housing, and food, of course. And these arguably have been the most impacted by the responses that governments have taken to the COVID pandemic. So for instance, the restrictions we're seeing on movement and how economic activity has had to come to almost come to a halt in many countries across the world. And this is having a particularly negative effect on the enjoyment of economic, social, and cultural rights. For instance, in Nairobi just this week, a homeless man was shot and killed by the police because he was found outside during the curfew hours. Now, this man is homeless. There's nowhere he was going to go to. But because of, as has been mentioned by previous speakers, the curfew and the way that these restrictions are being enforced, we are losing a lot more lives and causing a lot more harm and damage from the responses that are being made to the pandemic rather than the pandemic itself, particularly in Africa. And the chair shared something similar from Nigeria. In as much as countries like South Africa have implemented sort of temporary camps and shelters for homeless people, there's still reports from these shelters of women being raped and just being subjected to gender-based violence while they're in the shelters. So even when there are positive steps being taken, we're seeing governments not really going all the way through, not following through with these responses to ensure that the measures first are sensitive to the most vulnerable and the most marginalized in the societies, and that they are still protected, their safety, their dignity, the rest of their rights are still protected, even in the response. So I'm going to highlight two main factors, beginning with a bit of a background. I think one thing for these rights, economic, social, and cultural rights, the one thing that has come out very clearly is that the severe risk when it comes to leaving the management and the delivery of these rights only to, or primarily to, private sector, leaving it to market forces to be the ones to deliver education and healthcare. Just because of the scale of the pandemic and the scope of the pandemic, a lot of the private sector actors just were not caught ready for it. The way that they operate, for instance, the profit-driven ones, just don't have the capacity to respond at the scale and the scope that we needed a response, which is why you'll have countries like Spain, for instance, nationalizing all the private hospitals. So now all the private hospitals are temporarily public so that the government can be the one to manage, because ideally the government has the capacity, has the obligation under the human rights framework. It's the government that has the obligation to ensure that the rights are realized. So it really needs to be the one that sort of holds the system together and is able to manage the system to ensure that even the most marginalized are able to be reached by, to enjoy these rights, So in response to that, the first reflection to share on this is the importance of strong and resilient public systems. Public education systems, health systems that are well-resourced, have the capacity to reach more people, and are therefore able to be more adaptable and flexible in situations such as this. Because now we're talking about the COVID crisis, but we are aware that there are other crises that are looming. So for instance, with the climate crisis, we are likely going to have to face a few other challenges down the line. We've seen experts highlighting that there's a chance that other health-based crises are on the way as well. So it's important to reflect on these things now and put in the measures now to ensure that first in this response, we protect these rights, and then in the following, in case of any other crises that come down the line, we are already prepared. So schools, for instance, in Kenya, research has found that public schools were not ready to transition to online learning, but private schools were a lot more agile and able to do that. This is ironic and problematic considering the majority of school enrollment is in public schools. That means most of the children are not able to continue really with their learning, as much as most of the facilities are being made available on electronic platforms through the internet. And it is commendable that the government has taken alternative measures. So there's TV and radio programs that are being rolled out through the Ministry of Education to ensure that education, the right to education, can somehow be protected even in the crisis. But still, the evidence shows that for far-flung areas, in informal settlements, children are not able to access televisions, radios for themselves. They don't have smartphones or access to smartphones. So there's still a limitation in terms of how far they're able to reach. Someone mentioned, I think it was Dr. Solomon, talked about the vaccine that's coming up. And as we rethink how we organize our national systems, I think even internationally, we need to reflect on how we can have a more collaborative, more cooperative approach to these things. So there's a movement for a people's vaccine, for instance, that's pushing to ensure that there will be no limitations, financial limitations, intellectual property sort of limitations that would prevent less resourced countries, for instance, from accessing the vaccine once it's available. And this is a very key issue because we've already seen some countries angling to corner the market. So for instance, there were reports of Trump trying to pay off some of the German scientists who are working on a vaccine so that as soon as it's available, it goes straight to America first and it serves the Americans first, and the rest of the nations figure out another way. So it's important for us to rethink our national systems, but also globally, how we want to organize ourselves and work together. And I'm glad that one of the participants raised the question of how can we be good neighbors, because that's the spirit, I think, that we need to embrace. How can we, even as we think about our own systems, be cognizant of how interconnected we are. Clearly, if a virus can spread across the whole world in such a short time, we are very interconnected. Therefore, our responses and approaches also need to keep that in mind. The second point, still focusing from the human rights position of states having the responsibility, is on the importance of effective regulation and accountability for both the public and the private sector. And on this, I think the students and young people have such a big role to play because we've seen them be so effective and such a powerful force for change. African countries in particular have received a lot of funding to respond to the COVID crisis. We need to be able to follow up with our governments, hold them to account, keep track, and make sure that they actually use the funds for what they're supposed to be used for. Because in many instances, particularly now as employment has been affected really badly, young people are bearing the brunt of inefficient or corrupt practices in the COVID response in the employment sector, and it's all going to spill on to health and education as well. So the government really needs to, in addition to people holding the government to account, the government also needs to do more to regulate effectively the private sector to ensure that even as we grapple with the response, the rights are still protected. For example, in Kenya, which is where I'm based, when the first cases of COVID were confirmed, we had some insurance companies allegedly refusing to cover patients who were found to be COVID positive. And the government needed to step in, and the Insurance Regulatory Authority sort of compelled them to make sure that even where patients are found to be positive with COVID, they would still enjoy the insurance cover. So that it lightens the financial load on patients. Similarly, in Liberia, the government has implemented a policy that says even where companies need to cut salaries for non-essential staff, it shouldn't go below 50%. And we know livelihoods are really being affected by all the layoffs and the companies shutting down. But this is going to require the government to really proactively monitor and make sure that the private companies comply with these regulations and with these requirements. And I think my final point in conclusion is just that we are in an extraordinary moment in history. Just as Dr. Solomon said, we are now hearing conversations that previously seemed impossible, but now are within the realm of possibility. So for instance, the World Bank in a blog earlier this week, or is it last week, emphasized the importance of effective public institutions. And we know that previously their position hasn't really been in support of this, but this is just one example of how things are shifting, and there's an opportunity to be part of this shift, especially for young people who have the numbers and the drive and an interest, a personal interest to ensure that things shift in a positive direction. That's all.
Thank you, Ashina, very much. And members, at least we've had most of the discussions happening. And as the panelists, you've been following the questions that have been directed to you, some of the issues that young people were raising all over the region. And most of the issues have actually been tackled. And as we come to the close, I would just want to give 1 minute to each of the panelists to be able to give a closing remark, and if they can also use the opportunity to answer any questions that were directed to them. And I would love to start with Ms. Karin, and then we can be able to move forward. Yes, Ms. Karin.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Let me just say that it's been a pleasure to be with you all, sharing the platform with Justice Oregon, Dr. Solomon, all the other speakers. And I think it's safe to say that this is the time we need to have conversations like this. conversations that have been ongoing and important. And I think the fact that we are restricted from traveling, in a way, it does give us the time to actually meet on these virtual platforms and having deep and serious conversations. So that's if there's a silver lining that we could talk about, maybe that is that. I would like to say that Mauritius has been listed by the WHO as the country with the second highest level of preparedness on addressing the pandemic. Why? First of all, is a political will and dedicated constant engagement with the population, constant updates, but most importantly, it's because the country has been investing in its public health system for decades before that. What does that mean? It means that on the continent, Africans, decision makers, policy makers, but also activists, young people, must document, learn, advocate, and use best practices that we've known. We must learn from history. And what does our history, what does it teach us? It teaches that what we've learned from previous outbreaks of diseases such as Ebola are very clear. When rights are blatantly abused, citizens have no incentive to respond to government appeals to change their behavior. Because with the public health crisis that we're being faced with, like the one we're being faced with, we need to change our behaviors. We need to change how we socialize, how we interact, how we work, how we live. People have been using now this, I've been coining this term, the new normal. This is our new normal for now. We don't know how long it's going to be. Behavior change is one of the best ways of preventing the spread of the infection. And that is to ensure that already strained and inadequate healthcare systems are not overwhelmed. And for this to work, the trust between citizens and government is key. Accountability and oversight. Justice Orogan mentioned it, we've all mentioned it, but accountability, again, one cannot overemphasize the fact that accountability and oversight by appropriate institutions are key. Bottom-up consultations, partnering up with community leaders, artists, civic activists. And this partnership needs to be rooted in advancing human rights and endeavor to protect the rights of those at high risk of being harmed by the virus or its impact, such as the displaced, the migrants, older people, sexual minorities, women, and children. I'm just going to conclude by saying that this is the time for leaders, for all of us, I believe, to be ingenuous and creative and to draw lessons, again, from previous efforts to deliver more holistic, rights-driven approaches. And I think African governments should involve human rights institutions. I was almost about to forget that one. Very important. Human rights institutions like the African Commission as a key partner to promote and carry out a comprehensive people and rights-centered response to COVID-19. Thank you very much all. It's been an honor and hope to have more opportunities to engage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karine. I would love to give an opportunity to Mr. George to use his minute to wind up, and also at the same time, maybe if there are questions that were directed to him to be able to share. Yes, George, you have 1 minute.
Okay, so I fortunately for me, I didn't get any direct questions, so unless I didn't read it well. But I think one thing that is happening is that many African countries are going into elections this year. One thing that we must guard against is when political actors use economic stimulus package to influence vote. The second point I want to make is to guard against the often discrimination that women and persons with disabilities suffer when it comes to government support. So we should be careful and strategic in targeting women, persons with disability, and youth in ensuring and protecting their economic rights. The last point that I want to make is that, and this one is a general one that may not be directly related to COVID, but COVID is just telling us that as Africans, we need to hasten our desire to unite and present a common front so that we will begin to prioritize the economic well-being of our people. I am against the idea of AU setting Agenda 2063 for us to unite. And it is incumbent on you, the youth. I think I am no longer a youth. I am about 40. So the youth, to begin to challenge our government to say, we want a concerted effort to solve the economic challenges that are coming from this continent. And AU must provide that leadership. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, George. I would love to give an opportunity to Professor Kate to be able to give her last remarks, and in case there are questions which were directed to her in the chat, she can be able to also respond to them within a minute.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. I looked down the questions. It didn't seem as if there was anything very specifically aimed at me, but I just wanted to congratulate the All Africa Students Union for convening this conversation. I think this is a really important topic, as I think all the speakers have made clear, and one that is, although we hope that the pandemic will go, is of real importance and will be of real importance going forward. And I'd also like to say what an honor and pleasure it has been to share the platform with all the other speakers. Finally, I suppose the last thing really to be said is that this is a moment in which we could either kind of weaken or strengthen our democracies and our protection of human rights. And at the end of the day, the important thing for protection of democracy and human rights is that people in civil society remain active and alert and contributing to that project. So it really lies in all our hands to use this moment to ensure that democracies are strengthened and that human rights are protected, although that is no easy task. And I wish everybody well with that going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We would love to give the opportunity to Ms. Nozolo. As Nozolo tries to come back on, Ashina, please, you could give your closing remarks. Ms. Ashina?
Thank you, Emmanuel. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Fantastic. Okay, I just also wanted to congratulate the All Africa Students Union on putting together a very timely and interesting discussion. I hope that we'll be able to continue sharing these reflections and building up the movement for change, especially in this moment.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And I think most of the panelists have been able to speak. If there is one I've left behind, please let me know, but also in terms of response. As the moderator of the session, I would love to thank everybody who has participated, and in a special way, I would like to recognize Gift Shiagupa, Lufike Muyenga, Vera Nar, Feyesi Ojira, and Abdukadri, and many other young people who have been able to take time to ask questions and guide the panel discussion that has been happening. And at the same time, I would also like to use the opportunity to recognize the national students leaders that are present in this meeting, the young people from Nigeria, national student leaders from Nigeria, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Seychelles, Eswatini, the East African youth students and youth organizations, Cape Verde, Tanzania, Rwanda, Ethiopia, Angola, Ivory Coast, Togo, Mozambique, Malawi, Burundi, Kenya, and Sao Tome and Principe. These are also young people who are also joining us through Facebook. Majority of them are joining us through Facebook that may not have been able to join here. And the discussion continues, the engagement continues. One thing I would love to say and close on is that social distancing is no excuse for policy distancing. As young people, we should stand together, and we are also blessed and lucky to have the likes of Professor Kate John, the Dr. Solomon, and Ms. Karin, and the team of panelists, Ms. Zolo from South Africa. We thank all of you, Mr. George, for engaging with us, and most importantly, having your voices support the voices of the young people, but mostly push. As we conclude this session, we also want to thank the All Africa Students Union that has been able to bring together the voices of both the young people and bridging the gap to the policymakers we have. And not only that, bringing policymakers who are part of government and those who still influence government processes within the entire African region. Let us continue the discussion online, and let us be able to push further, ask for our rights to be met. And remember, social distancing is no excuse for policy distancing at all costs. I still remain as Emmanuel Wabwire, and I would love to thank you all for engaging. Have a blessed evening.
During this time of uncertainty, the government should be proactive in order to mitigate the current effects and aftermath of COVID-19. For example, poverty, prices on commodities have gone up, workers are only receiving their basic salary. We have also seen a rise in domestic violence, child abuse, and youth unemployment. The vulnerable population is being affected considerably. Hence, good governance will mean adapt to this new normal and invest in innovative ways to alleviate the effect of COVID-19 on this group while ensuring economic stability.
My name is Iyasu Geto Aduna. I am the president of Eastern African Students and the Youth Organization. I endorse ASU webinar on the topic of the COVID-19 pandemic management in Africa, implication of human rights and good governance. During the COVID-19 pandemic, there are incremental violation of human rights, malpractices, and the problem of good governance. For instance, there are domestic violences, sexual assaults, robbery, and early marriage, which is directly related to closure of schools. And also, in different parts of Africa, there is a declaration of a state of emergency, which was basically declared for the management of COVID-19 pandemic. But in some parts of Africa, in some countries, there are abuse of power by government officials during the COVID-19. And also there are violations of human rights. So on the behalf of Eastern African Students and the Youth Organization, I would like to alert all government officials, civic society organizations, and all stakeholders to give attention for the increment of the violation of human rights and the problem of good governance during the era of COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you very much. May Almighty God protect Africa from COVID.
We believe that human rights are inherent. There's no debate about human rights. And as governments in various parts of the continent try to manage COVID-19, they must be wary and aware of also how to manage the human rights and also protect the individual human rights of each and every citizenry of a certain country. And we believe to say through such a webinar organized by ASU, we are going to be able to understand and peer into the aspects of human rights protection during the COVID-19 pandemic. I thank you.
Revolutionary salutations, all comrades. My name is Mlamul Kumeta. I'm the current president of the Swaziland National Union of Students. We appreciate this invitation by the All Africa Student Union to join the webinar on the management of COVID-19 pandemic in Africa, looking at the implications on human rights and good governance. COVID-19 has exposed our Swazi government on lack of respect for human life. This is said because it is evident in the poor healthcare system, which is a prime objective and pillar for the building of every country to have quality healthcare. There's more actually we can discuss on regarding this topic, and I'm hoping that tomorrow when we engage on the session, there's actually a lot that will be discussed and we shall have a fruitful engagement and make resolutions. Forward with the United States of Africa forward. Luta continua.
Hi, I'm Kondwani Peter Mangoni from the University of Malawi Students Union. The COVID-19 pandemic is one our world was definitely not prepared for. It has come as a weighty or severe menace to the health of humanity. This has forced governments all around the world to take imperative measures to limit and curb the spread of COVID-19 pandemic as a public health safety measure and also providing medical care to those affected. Right to life reigns supreme above all other rights, in my opinion. As such, government have been acting to defend the human rights of health and life itself. Unavoidably, these measures limit our human and fundamental rights to an extent hardly experienced after the World Wars. It is necessary to ensure that such restrictions are consistent with our legal safeguards. Above all, their impact on particular groups of people is adequately taken account for. Thank you very much.
Todos os estudantes de África e a diáspora. Eu respondo pelo nome de Samira Chelsea Casimiro Manissa, presidente da Associação de Estudantes da Universidade de São Tomás de Moçambique. Venho por meio desta parabenizar o governo de Moçambique, dizer que eles estão a fazer o bem para com que essa doença não possa alastrar-se. E que todos os estudantes encontram-se seguros, pois encontramos em quarentena domiciliar. No entanto, temos 307 casos do Covid-19 e eu quero, desde já, agradecer a All Africa Studio por apoiar e por estar conosco neste momento de delicadeza, e também quero dizer que juntos podemos construir a África que queremos. Quero saudar a liderança da All Africa Studio aqui e a todos os estudantes de África. Muito obrigada.